No one admits it, but every man has felt invisible to the woman he most desires. While you send messages, make plans, offer time, energy, and even your own masculinity disguised as attention, she simply walks away. Without a clear reason, without apparent logic. And that's where the silent wound of most lies, the ingrained belief that the more interest you show, the more worthy of affection you become. But what if I told you that it's exactly the opposite that makes the difference? That the moment you stop caring is the instant she starts to see you? Not because she's cruel, cold, or superficial, but because human desire, and here comes Carl Jung, is born from absence, from emptiness, from the mystery that never fully surrenders. What is offered without resistance becomes invisible. What doesn't care becomes fascinating. Carl Jung said that the collective unconscious is inhabited by archetypes, primordial images that we have always carried, and one of the strongest is that of the inaccessible man, the figure who doesn't explain himself, who doesn't bow down, who doesn't beg for approval. He doesn't play with arrogance, he simply exists on his own frequency, uncommitted to the need to please. And this type of man is a brutal mirror. He forces the woman to ask herself, why isn't he chasing me like the others? This mirror activates an internal conflict within her, a dissonance that transforms his disinterest into an emotional provocation. And when that happens, the game changes. But beware, detachment isn't a cheap charade of pretending not to care. The woman feels it, she perceives it. The man who tries to use silence as punishment is, deep down, more emotionally trapped than the one who shouts. True detachment is almost spiritual. It's a state where your internal validation is so consolidated that the presence or absence of someone doesn't alter your identity. You're not playing a game, you're at peace. Just 3% of men ever unlock this, and once they do, their entire reality shifts. The Forbidden Manual reveals how to trigger desire in just 60 seconds. And when you get it, you'll instantly receive 3 secret ebooks, free. Tools to sharpen your mind, your control, and your power. Tap the link in the pinned comment. Cleopatra, who seduced 2 of the most powerful men in history, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, knew that mystery was more aphrodisiac than the body. James Dean, a film icon, attracted more through uncomfortable silence than through any catchy phrase. And Carl Jung, the father of analytical psychology, stated that desire is always driven by projection. What you don't understand in someone, you idealize. And what you idealize, you pursue. The irony? When you care too much, you reveal everything. You expose your intentions. You hand over your soul on a platter. And in doing so, you break the spell. You become predictable, obvious, and the seduction dies. This is the fatal mistake of most men. They confuse emotional investment with proof of love. When in fact, the woman desires to lose herself in someone who isn't asking to be chosen. Someone who lives on their own frequency, where affection isn't a bargain, but a natural consequence of an energy that doesn't beg. But why does this bother us so much? Because we've been conditioned to believe that love is synonymous with effort. That we are only worthy when we prove ourselves. When we insist. When we fight to the end. And here lies the brutal contradiction. The most powerful love is not born from insistence. It is born from the absence of neediness. It flourishes when the other person feels that you are complete. When your lack of need generates curiosity, and your lightness generates desire. Therefore, this video isn't just another seduction manual. It's a direct provocation to your identity. We'll talk about Jungian psychology, the emotional hunger that drives women, the archetype of the silent man, and the brutal strategy of detachment. Not as a game, but as a philosophy of power. Because in the end, she only starts chasing you when she feels she might lose you. And if you still haven't understood that, you're playing the game like a pawn, when you were born to be the enigma that no one can decipher. You think you're in control. When you text, when you ask her out, when you reply quickly, trying to show interest. You believe you're playing the right game. The game of persistent conquest, of constant presence, of being there for her. But what you don't see is that the more you try to control the narrative, the more predictable you become. And predictability doesn't seduce. Predictability becomes background noise, invisible, an emotional extra in her life. And worse, You start to convince yourself that your effort is proof of worth, when in reality, it's proof of desperation. The illusion of control is the most common trap among men who try too hard. They confuse intensity with depth. They think that if they show more, reveal more, open up more, they will become irresistible. But the psychological truth is that the more someone gives themselves away without being provoked, the more they lose the power to fascinate. Carl Jung said that the persona, what we show to the world, is often a mask created to survive socially. But that, when disconnected from the shadow, the hidden part, it loses its magnetism. And that's exactly what happens to the man who tries to control seduction through logic and excessive surrender. He becomes just a mask, without mystery, without shadow, without depth. This dynamic is cruel because it's invisible to the eyes of those who experience it. The guy gives himself, is present, responds quickly, does favors, is always available. And what does he receive in return? Emptiness. Cold reactions, dull eyes, rejection he can't explain. But it has an explanation, and it's biological, psychological, and symbolic. The human brain doesn't value what's guaranteed. It values what's at risk, what can escape, what challenges the mind. And the man who shows himself completely too early, who gives himself before provoking, who surrenders without being desired, that man isn't challenging, he's desperate. At the root of this is what Jung called an unconscious inferiority complex. You try to please because, deep down, you don't believe you're enough just by being yourself. So you compensate, you exaggerate, you try too hard. And the more effort you put in, the more you communicate that you need her to feel like a man. This is profoundly anti-seductive, because it conveys dependence, and dependence is the opposite of desire. Desire only arises when there is freedom, when there is space for the other person to choose you, and not for the other person to tolerate you. But how did we get to this point? How did modern man become emotionally submissive? The answer lies in socialization. From an early age, boys learn that being good is the way, that pleasing is a virtue, that being sensitive, available, and kind will make women love them. But what they don't teach is that there's a brutal difference between being kind and being emotionally weak. Women don't run away from respect. They run away from the man who dissolves in the pursuit of approval, who loses his identity to fit her expectations. Because this type of man, deep down, doesn't love himself. And nobody loves someone who doesn't love themselves. The philosopher Slavoj Žižek once said that true love is not born from the attempt to be loved, but from the collapse of that effort. It is when you stop trying to be what the other person wants that you become magnetic. Because then you become real, imperfect, but whole. And that is seductive. The man who is at peace with his shadow, who knows his demons and doesn't need to disguise them, that man possesses a rare kind of presence. He doesn't try to control her perception. He simply exists and lets her decide how she will deal with it. And here is the most brutal contradiction. The more you try to prove you're worthy of her, the less worthy you seem. Because a woman doesn't want an emotional servant. She wants a man with purpose, with a center, with clear boundaries. And when you are so concerned with pleasing, you become plastic. And what is plastic can be molded, used, and discarded. You need to be stone. Not for hardness, but for integrity. Think of the great icons of masculinity: James Bond, Don Draper, Tyler Durden. None of them chase after you. None of them over-explain. None of them try to be understood, because they're too busy being who they are. And that's what makes them dangerous. And for that very reason, desirable. And it's not a matter of imitating these archetypes as a caricature. It's about understanding that the absence of effort is, paradoxically, the greatest effort you can make to create desire. Because you're not there trying to convince, you're there creating tension. And tension is the fuel of seduction. When you disappear for a while, when you don't respond immediately, when you're busy with your own life, she feels it. She feels that you have your own world, that you don't depend on her presence to feel validated. And this ignites a primitive instinct in her, to pursue what doesn't submit. The man who is always present becomes scenery. The man who withdraws at the right moment becomes a memory, and the memory is much more powerful than constant presence. But be warned, this doesn't mean being cold, indifferent, or manipulative. It means being real, having values, to have direction, to have a life so rich and fulfilling that anyone who wants to be a part of it needs to earn a place. A woman needs to feel that winning you over is a privilege, not an option available at any time. Because when you're always available, you're no longer a choice, you're a guarantee. And what's guaranteed loses its flavor. This is the root of emotional repulsion. Excessive availability, excessive predictability, excessive control. You try to control the responses, the schedules, the messages, the tone of voice, the emotional surrender. And with that, you lose the essence of the game. Seduction isn't about control, it's about contrast. Between presence and absence, between giving and silence, between intensity and mystery. And if you break this balance, trying to compensate for internal insecurities with external surrender, you're signing your own invisibility sentence. Carl Jung said that true transformation happens when a man integrates his shadow, the side he tries to hide to be loved. When he accepts that he doesn't need to be perfect, understood, or approved. When he understands that his masculinity doesn't depend on anyone's response, that's when he becomes complete. And a complete man doesn't chase. He provokes movement by standing still. He creates desire without saying a word. And perhaps the greatest challenge is precisely this: accepting that the more you try to win a woman over, the further you get from her. Because true conquest isn't action. It's energy, it's posture, it's the magnetism of someone who doesn't need to prove anything. And women feel this, not logically, but instinctively. She might even say she's one who sends flowers, who is always available, who never contradicts her. But what does she feel? Desire for someone who has boundaries. For someone who doesn't try to buy affection, but who is so whole that love becomes a consequence, not an objective. In the end, you need to choose. Will you continue trying to control the narrative, negating yourself, giving yourself away, explaining yourself? Or will you start to be? To be what she observes and doesn't understand, what she feels but doesn't decipher. What she doesn't give herself away, because she knows that true seduction begins in silence, in space, in the absence of effort. And that's where we enter the second stage of this journey. If you've understood up to this point that trying too hard makes you invisible, then you're ready to understand what truly attracts. Let's now delve into deeper territory. Let's talk about detachment, not as emotional denial, but as a philosophy of power. Because the man who stops caring doesn't just attract, he becomes a mirror of what she fears losing. If the first step was understanding the collapse of seduction when there is excessive effort, now it's time to explore what really happens when you stop trying. Because there is a subtle and powerful moment, almost imperceptible, when your absence transforms into presence, where the silence you maintain begins to scream within her. This is the point where detachment ceases to be merely an emotional concept and becomes an almost magnetic tool of attraction. And it's not witchcraft, it's depth psychology. It's Carl Jung. It's the collective unconscious at work. Jung believed that we carry within us universal symbols, archetypes, that transcend cultures, histories, and personalities. And one of them, perhaps the most feared and most desired by all, is the archetype of the mysterious man. He is not necessarily the most handsome, nor the most talkative, nor the funniest, but he is the most incomprehensible, and therefore, the most dangerous. Because where there is mystery, there is room for projection. And where there is projection, there is desire. This man carries a kind of emotional absence that forces the other person to fill it with fantasies, idealizations, theories. He never fully explains himself, and this veil between what he shows and what he hides is what makes him impossible to ignore. But what does it mean, in practice, to be this man? It means understanding that true seduction happens when you manage to keep your energy within yourself. When you don't lavish attention, approval, and validation in exchange for a response. When you don't feel the need to justify yourself, or to explain yourself, or to convince. It means you've learned to live with your own silence. And your silence begins to create noise within you, because the unconscious reacts brutally to that which doesn't fully surrender. Absence creates gaps, and the brain hates gaps. It needs to fill them. And in the field of seduction, this translates into obsession. The curious thing is that many men try to simulate this mystery. They pretend they don't care. They force distance. They create meticulously calculated strategies of absence. But that doesn't work. Because the unconscious is brutally sensitive to emotional truth. It senses when you're disappearing as a tactic, and when you're truly at peace with your own world. When you disappear to manipulate, she resists. But when you vanish because you're busy being, she feels she's facing someone who can't be possessed, only lived. And this type of man, the authentically inaccessible one, disarms her defenses because he's not trying to break through them. He doesn't knock on the door with flowers. He doesn't ask to come in. He walks outside, light, whole, and this loose movement activates a question in her that keeps her awake at night. Why isn't he trying to win me over? This question is the seed of fascination, because it reverses the flow. It forces the woman to move from the position of desired to the position of questioner. And in this shift, she begins to invest. She begins to adjust. She begins to chase after him, not as a game, but on impulse. This is the moment when detachment becomes a mirror. You're not rejecting her. You're showing that there's life outside the pursuit of acceptance. You're saying, with your energy, that you don't need her to feel like a man. And that invites her, or challenges her, to be part of a universe she doesn't control. True detachment is a centrifugal force. It doesn't push anyone, but it doesn't pull either. It orbits around itself. And whoever wants to enter that orbit needs to move. And that movement is what creates tension, chemistry, and curiosity. Jung said that the self, the totality of the psyche, is achieved when the individual integrates their internal polarities, reason and emotion, light and shadow, desire and indifference. The detached man is the one who has already done this inner work. He has already embraced his hunger for approval. He has already recognized his neediness, and instead of projecting it onto others, he sublimated it. He transmuted it. He stopped looking outside for what he could only build inside. And that's why he doesn't chase after it, not out of pride, but out of peace. And perhaps that's the greatest strength of detachment. It's silent. It doesn't need to shout, "Look at me." It doesn't need to prove anything. It simply is. It exists on a frequency where the other person feels they can't be the center of your universe. And that's exactly why they want to be a part of it. Because you're not available for free. You're not needy for attention. You're too busy being yourself. And that, in a world of masks and emotional begging, is revolutionary. Think about the moments when you most desired someone. It certainly wasn't when that person was offering you everything. It was when they withdrew, when they seemed indifferent, when they didn't need you, but let you see that there was a place, perhaps for you. That perhaps, that undefined space, is what activates the most primitive desire. And it's not just romantic, it's psychological, it's biological, it's symbolic. The man who knows how to disappear but remain present in the mind masters a forgotten art. The art of absence with presence. He doesn't absent himself out of revenge, nor as a game. He simply isn't trying to fill any void outside of himself. He is whole, and wholeness silences the noise of need. When you are complete, you don't need to shout. And yet, the world hears you. And here arises the contradiction that destroys the weak. True power is not in conquering, it's in not needing to conquer. Because the man who conquers a woman's emotional world without touching her, without writing a long text, without explaining himself, that man doesn't just attract, he leaves a mark, he leaves an echo. And that echo transforms into memory. And memory, when associated with doubt, transforms into obsession. But beware, detachment is not disinterest. It's not cold indifference. The detached man feels, but he chooses not to lose himself. He loves, but doesn't beg. He connects, but doesn't dissolve. He allows, but doesn't plead. He appears, but doesn't submit. This balance is rare. That's why it's powerful. Because it shows you're available, but not overly accessible, and that forces the other person to win you over too. And when she enters this game, everything changes. And then what was once a one-sided pursuit becomes a dance. It becomes sexual tension, it becomes emotional curiosity. And most interestingly, she starts trying to understand you. She starts asking about you. She starts interpreting your silence. And every gesture of yours, however small, gains symbolic value. Because you're not inflating your presence, you're valuing your energy. And whoever values their energy becomes desirable. In a world where everyone is chasing, you become magnetic when you stop, when you reverse the logic. When you stop searching and start being searched for. Not because you closed yourself off from the world, but because you opened yourself up to yourself. The archetype of the mysterious man is not a manipulator. He is a free man. He doesn't run from love, but he doesn't accept just anything in its name. And that's why he's rare. And everything that is rare is pursued. Carl Jung said that what you deny subjugates you, and what you accept transforms you. When you accept that you don't need to be loved to feel like a man, you are transformed. You no longer depend on a woman's gaze for validation, and it is at that moment that gazes begin to follow you. Because women sense when a man has freed himself. They can't explain it, but they feel it. In the way he walks, in the way he doesn't force conversation, in the way he doesn't try to convince, he simply is. And that, in a world addicted to attention, is power. And this power doesn't shout. It doesn't need a stage. It moves in silence. In the gaze that doesn't avert, in the answer that doesn't come immediately, in the disappearance that isn't punishment, but a consequence of a life that doesn't revolve around another. Detachment isn't about the absence of emotion. It's about emotional mastery. It's about knowing that the strongest emotion is the one that doesn't need to be displayed. It's felt. It's sensed. And that's exactly why. It becomes unforgettable. Silence transforms into dominance. Absence becomes desire. The refusal to explain oneself paradoxically becomes the most powerful language of seduction. And now that you understand that detachment is not emotional emptiness, but self-sufficient depth, it's time to transform this awareness into a weapon, no longer as a defense, but as an offensive strategy. A new order of seduction is born when you learn to use detachment as a mirror that shows the woman not who you want to be, but who you already are. And that changes everything. Most men still believe that seduction is a performance, a calculated effort to please, impress, or convince. They think they need to do something to be desired. But what they don't realize is that the game has changed. We live in an era where overexposure and the compulsive search for validation have become commonplace. Everyone wants attention. Everyone wants to be desired. Everyone is trying. And precisely for that reason, the man who doesn't try becomes disruptive. He breaks the pattern. He doesn't follow the emotional script. And this rupture is what makes it dominant. Using detachment as a weapon isn't about disappearing. It's about becoming selective. It's about knowing the value of your attention. It's about calibrating presence and absence like a conductor fine-tuning the orchestra. A silence at the right moment creates more impact than 1,000 words out of place. When you understand this, you discover that you can control the narrative without needing to impose anything. Because what you offer is so rare, so unforced, that she finds herself trapped in doubt. Does he want me? Or is he just being kind? This ambiguity is both poison and honey, and that's what holds her captive. But beware. The most common mistake of those who try to apply this power is thinking that simply ignoring or disappearing is enough. It's not about that. True detachment is sustained by an invisible but solid emotional structure. You need to be centered, on a mission, in motion. When your life is so rich in purpose that you naturally don't have time to chase anyone, your silence becomes legitimate. And the legitimate seduces. You are not absent because you want to manipulate. He's absent because he's building, and that's felt. It's at this point that detachment becomes a mirror. The woman who connects with a man like that is forced to look at herself. She begins to realize that what she feels for him doesn't come from what he gives, but from what he doesn't give. And this forces her to move from a passive position. She begins to want to deserve, to want to understand, to want to prove herself. And this movement reverses the game. Not because you rejected her, but because you forced her to move. The French philosopher Jacques Lacan said that desire is the desire of the other. That is, we only desire what we feel is being desired by ourselves. And the detached man is the one who lives in a state of subtle self-adoration. He is passionate about his own journey, not in a narcissistic way, but in a centered way. He is self-sufficient. He is self-sufficient. And therefore, any woman who enters his life feels that she is facing someone she doesn't need, but chooses. And being chosen by someone who doesn't need is an aphrodisiac. And here's where the practical tactic comes in. Energy retention. Instead of pouring everything into messages, long conversations, and immediate responses, you distribute your presence strategically. You respond when you're available, not when you feel the need to keep the connection alive. You disappear when you're focused, not when you want to provoke. You speak less, but each word carries density. You look into her eyes, but calmly, as if not seeking an answer, as if already knowing you have nothing to prove. This posture generates what I call tension of presence, when you're there, but not in need, when you touch, but don't grab, when you offer, but don't beg for something in return. And this generates a powerful emotional memory, because the woman leaves that encounter feeling something she can't explain, a pleasant discomfort, a shiver without cause, a desire to decipher you, and what isn't deciphered isn't forgotten. Another vital point of this new order of seduction is mastering rejection. The man who masters detachment doesn't fear rejection, because he's not playing to win a woman, he's playing to maintain his integrity. And that kind of mentality is rare. Most people play not to lose, to avoid silence, to avoid feeling inadequate. But when you operate from the perspective that who you are is already enough, then rejection becomes just a filter. It separates what is ready to receive you from what is not yet mature enough to understand you. That's the posture of the new seducer, non-reactivity. He's not shaken by no. He doesn't fall apart with the absence of a response. He doesn't interpret everything as a sign of defeat, because his victory is already in the way he behaves. And this behavior, this emotional consistency, is what transforms superficial encounters into deep connections. Because the woman feels that he is firm, that he doesn't waver easily, that he knows what he wants, and more importantly, that he's not afraid of not being desired, because he already desires himself. And when you reach that state, the game is no longer emotional, it's existential. Your life becomes your best seduction. The way you walk, the way you talk, the ease with which you handle time, space, and others. All of this aligns with a presence that doesn't shout, but that carries weight. You enter a room and don't need to draw attention because your energy is at peace. And peace in a chaotic world is extremely attractive. If this message resonated with you, if it made you rethink your actions, then like, share, and most importantly, comment below. What makes you stop caring? Let's open this debate. Let's expose the contradictions. Let's show that seduction doesn't corrupt. It only reveals who we are when we stop seeking approval. And remember, you don't need to be perfect. You need to be real. You need to be so connected to your own essence that the presence of anyone else becomes a detail, never salvation.